Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this, I think, very important hearing. Dr. Gray, one of the issues that I constantly run into is government has a tendency to judge results by how much money we spend, not on actual results. One of the things that always comes to mind is in a number of hearings that we've had in this subcommittee and elsewhere is, for example, some of the Inspector General reports where they'll come back and they'll tell us about EPA, particularly in some of the outside grants in a bunch of different areas where they really, frankly, EPA doesn't have a good handle as to if we're getting any results at all. We're spending the money for good-sounding things, but frankly, there's no way of telling. I'm sure there are ways of telling, but we don't have any good data that tells us that we're actually paying for the actual studies as opposed to just good-sounding studies, and we're not getting the results. A couple questions based on that. Is there a way for the EPA to get other players, your other partners, and do you get other partners coming back to you with recommendations of where EPA can save money, can be more efficient? Is there a way to do that? Do you have a way that you can get that source? Does the Science Advisory Board come to you and tell you, hey, look, there's some areas here that we think we can find some efficiencies, or is that something that's not accepted by the EPA? It's not solicited, or it's just not? You just don't get a lot of that. And that would be my first question.
Well, in the agency, we're always looking to make sure that we are getting results for the resources that we're putting out, and I think that it's a place, especially if you look at the Office of Research and Development, one where we are pretty confident that the way in which we run our grant program, the way in which we integrate it into our intramural research program, so that there's alignment between the work that we're doing and the work that we're asking folks in the university community to do, actually does come together and help us make a difference in the science that's used by the agency. A great example of this is looking at National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We write what's called used to be called a criteria document, we now call it a science assessment for ambient air quality standards. The last one that was done for particulate matter, over 40% of the citations, the science that was used to support the ultimate decision that was made, came from work that was done by us or supported by us. So I'm quite confident that, in fact, we do a good job. On these areas of efficiencies, I'll tell you that I don't know the exact name. The agency, in addition to its Science Advisory Board, does have a Financial Advisory Board. And these are folks from outside of the agency who are there to help us think about the way in which we run the business of EPA. How can we do things well? How can we be more efficient? I could get you more information about that if you'd like for the record.
Actually, I would, and if there's something that you have that kind of shows some results in different areas, I'd like to have it. If it's something that even members of Congress can understand, it'd be obviously helpful. Mr. Sass, you mentioned for example, the Clean Air Mercury rule in your testimony, and your concern over the agency's ability to implement the CAMR adequately to lack of, and I don't know if I'm misquoting you, credible or reliable data. Should we wait to implement that or not because we don't have the reliable science or the reliable data? And anyways, or should we work? Should we not? Should we wait? Should we not wait?
Well, I mean, my hope is that EPA is going to go ahead on the best data that it has. The complication of that is that the EPA plan is sort of a cap-and-trade plan, and cap-and-trade makes the assumption that the pollutions are shared or distributed evenly, so if you remove it over here, you're reducing the whole pot of pollution, let's say. Without being able to do sampling to look at whether there's mercury hot spots, particular areas that are particularly vulnerable because they have high exposures, for instance, around coal-fired power plants, that release mercury, EPA is not going to know whether its cap-and-trade program is actually effective. If you're reducing it in one area, but one population is taking all the risk, then your national risk may go down, but your environmental justice issues, your populations at higher risk, remain at higher risk. So EPA should move ahead with the data it has, but it needs to do that hotspot monitoring so that it can measure the efficacy of its programs.
Do you mind if I... But the other issue is that mercury, I mean, what was just said is absolutely correct. There are hotspots. But mercury is also a global pollutant, and a significant amount of the mercury that we see in this country comes from natural sources around the world and from power plants in China and similar sorts of things. And unfortunately, while the agency does have a program to look at local and regional mercury issues, it doesn't have resources to try to understand the global mass balance of mercury, that is, where it comes from, how it moves through the environment, where it ends up. And without that sort of fundamental scientific understanding, there's limits to just how far you can go, and even to knowing whether the enormous amounts of money that power plants are going to be called upon and are being called upon to spend will always necessarily get the improvements we want. None of this is to say we shouldn't take action. It is to say, however, that there are important fundamental science issues that one really needs to underpin the development of regulation, because absent that, you could do things that were inefficient or counterproductive.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, thank you, sir. Thank you for indulgence. I'm not quite sure, but I mean, am I hearing that we should or should not wait to implement? I'm not quite sure if with that answer, you're saying that we should wait to implement or we should not wait to implement. I'm not quite sure. Whoever.
We should move forward with the data we have, and then continue to collect the data we need.
Mr. Morgan, let me just ask you this, because you pointed something about other countries. Is the United States the first country to require reduction in mercury emissions?
Well, mercury issues are serious all around the world, and I can't tell you in detail what the regulatory environment across the EU is, but I know there's similar concerns. But the other point is that one needs to differentiate between a scientific standard. I mean, in science, you don't publish until you've you try to avoid false positives, that is, to suggest things that aren't there. But regulation is essentially a public health issue, and there you need to move when there is strong suggestive evidence, even if it isn't definitive, because the point there is to be protective of human health. And so there is a clear difference between, whether I should say something definitively scientifically, that is, whether I can get it published in a journal, and whether the agency should move on something. When the evidence is sufficient to suggest there is a problem, then it behooves the agency to be protective.